Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. We are so happy that you are able to join us here today for this really important webinar. We are going to allow for a few moments for folks to sign in, and then we will go ahead and get started. So if you'll just allow us a couple of moments. In the meantime, if you have any questions or you have issues connecting to audio, feel free to chat us. Using the chat feature on Zoom, you can send a message to the panelist, or if you need the call-in number for the webinar, feel free to send us a message there as well. And we'll get started here shortly. Thank you. Hi, everyone. If you're just joining us, thank you for being here with us. We are waiting just another moment or so to allow for more participants to join us for this live webinar. So we will get started here in just another minute. If you have any questions or have issues with connecting to us, please feel free to send us a chat message. Okay, so it looks like we have a good number of attendees here for our webinar, and our guest speaker is all set. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, everyone, thank you for joining us today. We are going to be talking about how do you ensure ADA compliance during COVID-19 and communicate and have the proper communication for people with disabilities. And our guest speaker here today is my esteemed colleague, Dr. Zach Taylor. He is an institutional support consultant. I work with him very closely on supporting our partners here at Trellis Company. He has an extensive background in communication overall, but he'll talk a little bit more about his background, his expertise, and the research that he has put together on this topic. We're really excited to have him present on this. I will say that we are going to take questions at the end, but feel free to chat them throughout the webinar to us because I know this happens to me when I'm listening to a live webinar. I have a question, and then by the end I forget it. So don't forget your question, send it to us via chat. You are also welcome to use the Q&A feature if you'd like. You can submit a question through Q&A. You can send it to me via chat. And if you have any connection or audio issues, feel free to chat that to us. I'll also add that we are recording this webinar. So we will have the recording and the slide deck available to all participants in just a couple of days after the webinar. So stay tuned for that. You'll hear from me in a couple of days. With that, I will hand it over to Zach and let him take it from there.
Excellent. Sounds good. Thank you so much for the introduction and welcome everyone. The very first thing I want to point out today is if you notice on the bottom of your screen, you should see a live captioning feature in the very bottom of your screen. Now, this is a brand new accessibility feature that was incorporated into the most recent version of the Microsoft Office suite. So this session today is going to be part demonstration and kind of part best practices, and then there's going to be a bunch of free resources that practitioners can use to make sure that all the communication you disseminate, whether that's email or on a website or on a text message or on a social media post or a PowerPoint or a PDF or a Word document, that they can be as ADA compliant as possible. The first thing I want to show you is how to set up this live captioning, because I know a lot of y'all are running a lot of Zoom meetings and a lot of you are recording a lot of them. And this live captioning feature is actually an ADA compliance feature that allows you to have live captioning for any video that you produce. So if I were to take this video recording and put it on YouTube, it would already have the closed captioning, which would render this video ADA compliant. So I'm going to exit out actually of my PowerPoint, and I'm going to show you at the very top, if you can see my PowerPoint screen, the menu on top with Home, Insert, Draw, Design. If you click on Slideshow and then click on Always Use Subtitles. So the feature is called actually Subtitles. It's in the newest version of Microsoft Office 365 and PowerPoint. So if your office runs on Office and on PowerPoint and Word, you can use this feature. You can also dictate where the captions or the subtitles will go, so you can overlay it actually on the slide. You can put it on top on the slide. below the slide or above the slide. It actually has learned my language. I'm a native English speaker, but the more you use the software, the more it trains to your voice, and you can actually speak in many, many different languages, and it'll caption and use subtitles really, really accurately. I have a few friends who speak Turkish and Chinese, Spanish, Vietnamese, Tagalog, Filipino. They've all used this software and say it's pretty accurate. So just want to make folks aware of that as well, because a lot about accessibility is also language accessibility, and making sure that if you have the capacity at your institution to kind of close captioned and have the options in English and in Spanish, especially in a Texas context, it's very important, because so many of our students are Spanish speakers, or their support networks are Spanish speakers. So as you see, as soon as you launch the PowerPoint, the live captioning feature can start, although you can see that there's a little bit of a lag. So I won't run it the entire time today, but I wanted to make you aware of that feature. And I'll quickly introduce myself. So Zach Taylor, I'm working at Trellis Company as an institutional support consultant. Since 2018, I've published a few studies on ADA compliance, especially web accessibility. So making sure that your website is ADA compliant, and there are specific standards written into law and into ADA in Section 508 that apply to all Title IV institutions of higher education, which are many of the folks on the call today. Over 30 presentations focused on ADA since 2018, and all of those articles I've written for a practitioner audience, so I would think they're a little easier to understand. They have very easy to follow steps. And if you want those articles, feel free to email me and I'll pass those along to you. I have permissions to share all of that work. Giving a little bit of an overview today, just what has COVID-19 done to the community, especially thinking about both K-12 students and higher education students, what COVID-19 means, what accessing a higher education website looks like, and I'll actually show you an example of one. We're going to define a few concepts. So what is web accessibility? The W3 is a very powerful organization that has actually written disability compliance standards that are written into law, and then what sections 504 and 508 are, and then going through all of the kind of how-to information, how to write websites in accessible fashion, choosing fonts, building emails, building PowerPoints, Word documents, PDFs, and then at the very end, I'll answer some questions and then distribute some very free resources that will allow you to do some compliance checks on your own, so your students are accessing the most accessible content. Here are some of the headlines that we've seen kind of pulled from the news. So many students in special education at the K-12 level really rely on their paraprofessionals or their special education teachers or case managers. I was a high school teacher. I taught blended special education English, and I know how intensive that process can be in supporting students with disabilities through academic processes, given that students have so many different disabilities, and you need to be really, really sensitive to each one of those and support each student in a very kind of idiosyncratic, unique way. And imagine now taking this really vulnerable population, removing them from the classroom, and then placing them at home, where their support system, their parents may not be able to deliver the same education, and then thinking about the lack of protections at the post-secondary level about those students with disabilities who were receiving some on-campus supports are now at home and completely removed from campus, completely removed from their support networks that they're used to. It can be a really jarring experience for a lot of students across the country because they've been forced home. Now at the K-12 level, to kind of draw some parallels, a lot of you have probably heard of FAPE, or Free Appropriate Public Education. In essence, even in crisis times, K-12 schools have to provide free appropriate public education for all students, and that's heavily differentiated. Some students need a little bit more support, some students need a little bit less, but it's FAPE for everyone. Now, Secretary DeVos recently released new information that kind of clarified how federal law would apply during a crisis time like COVID-19. And higher education was not mentioned throughout that entire statement. And that's partially due to the fact that when a student becomes an adult and is removed from the K-12 system, post-secondary education is no longer compulsory. So there are lots of ADA and IDEA education protections in K-12 that do not carry over into higher education. And if you're curious, you can click on that story to read more at the very bottom. And this one quick question, I did turn off the subtitling for this presentation just because there's a little bit of a lag, but I can show at the very end how to re-engage with that software and run that. So in terms of ADA protection in higher education, IDEA states that post-secondary qualified students are any student with a disability who meets academic or technical standards for admission and participation. So if a student has a disability and can document it and gets into the institution, they are essentially a qualified student and are eligible for some protections. And if you zip forward to those second and third bullet points, essentially institutions have to provide academic adjustments and auxiliary aids. So an academic adjustment may be a longer testing period or an off-site testing space that a student can take an examination on their own. An auxiliary aid might be closed captioning a video and having lectures that are live captioned. It could be a sign language interpreter in the room to interpret the lectures to a student. Those are auxiliary aids. However, colleges and universities do not need to make those adjustments if it's going to impose an undue burden. And that is where there has been an explosion of ADA-focused legislation and litigation in the courtroom, because that term undue burden can mean so many different things to so many different schools. So a lot of students just don't document their disability. And I was one of them as an undergraduate. I tried documenting my disability, and after the third or fourth sheet of paperwork, I just gave up. It was so difficult to document, and I didn't know what I could ask for, because those K-12 protections largely do not carry over into a post-secondary setting. So in essence, academic adjustments and auxiliary aids is the extent of what institutions have to provide under ADA if they don't cause an undue burden. Now, access to higher education is a totally different subject. So I am going to quickly point out an example on the UT Austin website. This was just a few years ago. You can see some of the dates under the upcoming events. This is an old version of their website, but I was trying to apply to institutions as if I had a vision impairment. So what I would do is I would blindfold myself and I would explore college websites and I would try to get to the application page. And so this website is very simple. The menu structure is very simple. The font is very readable. But upon further digging, I found that there were quite a few ADA compliance violations on this website. And one very particular one was a huge hurdle to access. So underneath this error window, there's kind of a black box that has the HTML code of that page. And in essence, it alerted me that there was something about the search button that was not ADA compliant. And in that error type, it said this button has no text within it. So a lot of people rely on screen reading technology to actually hover their mouse and right or left click on objects on a web page, whether that's a hyperlink or a picture or just some text. You can highlight text, and the screen reader will read that text back to the student. Well, something about that search button was missing text. And what I learned is that that search bar was the web page item that didn't have any text data. So as I was blindfolded exploring this website, I wasn't able to find the search bar. So I couldn't search for anything on this website because I couldn't find the item that used the screen reader technology to alert me that this is the search bar and you can enter search terms here. So I would have navigated this website forever and never have found that search bar. And that is a very simple way to be ADA non-compliant, is not to add text data to all of the web page elements on your web page. So what is web accessibility? It is essentially websites and web tools that are designed and coded to be used by staff, students, faculty, anyone with a disability. The W3 is the Worldwide Web Consortium, and they created the Web Accessibility Initiative decades ago. So these folks were on the ball way before Section 508 was passed in 1998, and then the most recent update to ADA and web accessibility compliance back in 2015. So the W3 is an excellent resource. They actually created the standards, and they created the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, so the WCAG standards. And those are the official standards that are the threshold of web compliance written into ADA. It's a wide range of recommendations. There are semesters long seminars and courses you can take about web accessibility and WCAG standards. I'm going to gloss over a few of them today, but I'm going to add a lot of resources at the end of this webinar. You can dig a little bit deeper and read more about what those standards are. So like I said, they are written into law by US Congress, so they are in ADA in Section 508 as the official threshold of compliance. And then there's a screenshot of the website, and as you can tell, they're organized into different principles, and then underneath those principles, there are guidelines. It's a really dense list of guidelines for web compliance. Web compliance is not easy, and that's why today I'm just going to provide an overview of what web compliance and accessibility is, and then you can explore more on your own. Most of your campuses have an IT professional or a disability compliance type office. Those are the folks you want to network with to go a little bit deeper if this is a totally new topic for you. So Section 504 of the Rehab Act of 1973 was kind of that big blanket law about educational discrimination against people with disabilities. And that has consistently been renewed over and over and over again. So Section 508 in 1973 was amended then in January 2018. And this amendment required all Title IV institutions to publish at least level 2 WCAG compliant websites. So within WCAG 2.0, there's level A, which is the lowest threshold, level AA, and level AAA. And WCAG then, and the most recent amendment to Section 508 required level AA compliance. So most people on this call today, if you're a Title IV institution, you must be level A and level AA compliant. And I'll show you some examples of what those are a little bit later. Essentially, that just re-emphasized the fact that websites and digital communication must be accessible. And it has continued to be updated because technology continues to advance. So for instance, in the latest WCAG 2.0 standards, virtual reality and virtual environments weren't really addressed. In the newest version of WCAG, it will be addressed, and eventually the law will have to change again, because now a lot of y'all are doing virtual tours, and there's going to be accessibility standards connected to those virtual environments as well. So as technology changes, the law will keep changing. But why was there a huge amendment in 2018? Long story short, it was because a lot of schools were being sued for ADA non-compliance. There was a man in New York State who had tried applying to 50 colleges and couldn't reach the application screen on any of those websites. So a lot of college and university websites, especially from an access perspective, students can't get to the web page, get to the application, and successfully complete the application using their assistive technology or whatever they're using to interact with the website and get the information that everyone else has access to. So essentially, the legislation kind of made a knee-jerk reaction and was seeing all these institutions being sued, especially between 2014 and 2017, and really got behind a renewed push to be ADA compliant across all higher education. So in publishing accessible websites, I have kind of some big issues, some big high-level concerns for you to consider. When I have presented this across the country, it's probably my 30th or 40th time presenting something like this. In every single audience I present to, someone raises a hand and says, what is web accessibility? Had never heard of web accessibility before in their entire career, even though they may have worked in higher education for many years. So I'm going to start kind of at a very high level and then zoom in to more of the kind of minutia of kind of day-to-day web compliance. So the first one is talk to your web developer at your school. Are they aware, and what are they doing? So I was on a web compliance audit team 2 years ago at a really large school. And their web developer had brought a concern to the kind of web audit compliance committee about the color scheme. So this institution's color scheme is kind of iconic. They're kind of known for these colors. But the thing is, it was a really light color and another really light color combined. It was a very light shade of blue and white. And it wasn't contrastive enough on the website. So students weren't able to pick out the text from the background color. And so that institution's kind of board of regents had to have a discussion about, we need to actually gently change our entire marketing and branding and institutional identity because we're not web compliant. Our color scheme isn't contrastive enough. So it may be a very high level concern that you want to get that discussion started about, what does our website developer know? What does our leadership know about web accessibility? Do these folks even know what we're talking about when we talk about it? Know how many people can edit your website. So as internet technologies and websites are really easy to build now, I mean, I can create an entire website on my cell phone in 5 minutes. I can download the WordPress app and create an entire website. It's ridiculously easy these days. But then it's also ridiculously easy to be ADA non-compliant. And especially if you keep inviting people to create their own pages, to create their own department web pages, to create their own resource files and upload files. So I had one institution, the very first thing I asked is, how many chefs in the kitchen? How many people can edit the landing page? Over 1,000. And there were only about 15,000 students at this school. So 1,000 people with IDs to log in and edit the landing page. I thought that was absolutely incredible. And I said, you gotta trim some people off of that permission, because that many people shouldn't be responsible for ADA compliance, especially the landing page, the splash page, the very public facing page. Also then, related to the number of users that can actually edit the site, how many old web pages don't you need? So I asked one financial aid office, I said, start searching for 2012, 2013, and see how many old FAFSA instructions or how many verification directions you have that are relevant to years ago and years ago that you don't need on the website anymore. They removed 100 pages from their website because it was outdated old content. So one really kind of low-hanging fruit that you can pick is, we don't have to be ADA compliant for what's not published on the website. So one of the first things you can do is just get rid of all the old content and then really focus on what students use and they use frequently and making that content as accessible as possible. Getting into more of the kind of day-to-day, and here's where we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the specifics of web accessibility, and I'll go into a few examples in a second. But defining the website's language. So a lot of y'all might have some translated content on that website. Well, students with disabilities can actually access your language tag or the language of your website. And if you don't notify them that there's content in English and in Spanish or in German, they may never know to look on that website. They may not know to keep scrolling to find that content. So it's really important defining the website's language, and that is actually ADA level A compliance. It's the very lowest level of compliance, is just defining the website's language. Using a really simple font. I know that especially in the marketing and communications world, there's lots of research about what kind of font draws the eye and what's attractive on print media versus online content. But I use Verdana in almost everything I do, and this entire presentation is in Verdana. It's a very web accessible font for some very specific reasons, and I'll show you those reasons in a second. But one thing I would suggest is don't get too pretty with the fonts. Use a simple, readable font like a Verdana or a Times New Roman on your website, and that'll really help with accessibility, especially for people with low vision, and I'll talk about that in a second. Using a really strong color contrast. So I'm kind of presenting a very boring looking webinar, but it's fully ADA compliant because I have strong color contrast. It's a very dark font and a very lightly colored background. And I'll show you an example of ADA non-compliance in a second, specific to color contrast. Adding alt text to pictures and closed captions to videos. So as websites are becoming easier to publish, creating digital content is easier than ever to publish. How many of you, when you upload a picture to your website, are always adding alt text and a description of that picture? Now, every single picture you upload should give a description of what is going on in that picture, and I will show you an example of that in a second. Same goes with videos. All videos should be closed captioned on Title IV institutional websites, and that's just the lowest level of compliance, level 1 or level A WCAG compliance. Hyperlinks should have informative titles. So every time you embed a hyperlink on a website, I should be able to hover over that link, and before I click on it, I should get a description of what happens when I click on that hyperlink. Where's it going to take me? This is the link to the undergraduate admissions application. So if I was going to link that application on my website, I should have a descriptive, informative title to tell the user exactly what happens if I click on that link. Heading sizes is a little bit more of a web developer issue, but some of you I know probably have web development permission on your website. Making sure that you're defining level 1 and level 2 headers is really important so that students know that if there's a level 1 header and there's more content underneath, to keep scrolling down and finding that level 2 and level 3 heading. Otherwise, a student, if you don't define the heading levels, they may stop scrolling at a blank spot on the page. They may not know to keep scrolling to find more content. So you have to be very clear about heading sizes, and you can define those very easily in a lot of web development technologies like WordPress makes it very easy. In terms of accessibility in font, font is very low-hanging fruit, and fonts are also very common across web development, Microsoft Word technologies, Adobe PDFs. A lot of the fonts are almost universal now, as is Verdana, so I use Verdana. Part of the reason I use it is it's highly compatible. So if you want to write a Google Doc or a Microsoft Word doc or export to an Adobe PDF, Verdana, Times New Roman, Calibri, Georgia, they are compatible across many different programs, and they also are compatible with iPhones and Androids. So some of those really common fonts, you have to think, students are going to access your content on a computer and on their mobile device, and really common, I hate to say boring fonts, are some of the most compatible across different devices. It's really important to think about that. Verdana has serifs or little feet that make the font really, really readable, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. So for example, illegal activity is frowned upon. Now, the spacing between each letter in Verdana and the serifs make it very easy to distinguish a capital I from a lowercase l in the word illegal. But if I use Arial, all of a sudden the capital I and the lowercase l look exactly the same. So if I had low vision, I would be able to read that Verdana font and that Verdana sentence much more easily than Arial. And it's also in the same size. And Verdana's letters are spread out just a little bit, and that little bit of spacing really helps people with low vision to be able to read your text. And then Hattenschweiler is kind of a common decorative font, but it's really, really hard to read because there are no serifs, and the letter spacing is so tight that it's a lot more difficult to read than Arial or Verdana. So just keeping that in mind about fonts, the font you pick absolutely does matter. In terms of font size and color contrast, here's an example from Portland State's website. A few things I want to draw your attention to. First, on the very, very bottom on the footer, if you notice that there's a dark green background and then light green font overlaid. And I'm sitting in my office, and I'm only about 2 feet from my computer, and I have about 20/20 vision. And I actually can't read all the words on that very bottom row. My eyes don't do a great job with color contrast. What would be really easy to do is make that font about 2 or 3 sizes larger, and then make it all white. Because if you notice on the very bottom of that footer, 2019 in white really pops out, whereas all the other links kind of wash into that background. And then look on this website on the right-hand side with the profile of that instructor, the instructor text really pops out at you, that white on that dark background, versus that footer material, which is kind of washed out. So here's an example of the font size is probably too small in the footer and nowhere near contrastive enough. And there actually are contrast scales that you can test your color contrast with to make sure that you're being compliant. Interactive elements. So as websites have become easier to make, they've become even more interactive. You can click and there's pop-up windows and there's videos and there's embedded social media feeds. It can be really, really complex. A student should know what happens before you interact with any element on the site. So I found a few compliance issues with this website because first, when I hovered over the apply online link right back here, I wasn't alerted that there was going to be a pop-up that alerts me to different application types. There was no prompt. So if I hovered over apply online, I wouldn't know where that link took me. And then after I hovered over each application type, there wasn't an instruction about which application type it was. So I would have clicked apply online. I may have found the pop-up, but if I was a freshman, I may have inadvertently clicked on the graduate application and I would have been taken to the wrong application type because I wasn't told in some informative text about where a link will take me before I click on it and what I will get to when I actually click on that link. You need to have the entire kind of pathway mapped out for a student. So again, this is probably something you want to work with your web developer on. It's a little bit more advanced probably for the kind of newbie or the everyday practitioner, but knowing that all of the links have to tell a student where they will go when they click on them is really, really important, especially for really interactive elements like this one. So writing ADA compliant emails, some very low hanging fruit. You can almost entirely assure ADA compliance in emails if you follow some of these steps. So first, write them in Word to start and copy and paste them in. So in a lot of email templates and applications, there's not a spell check feature built in, and Outlook and Google and in Gmail there is now, but Word actually has a lot more accessibility features built in than Google does or Outlook currently does. So I would suggest begin writing your email in Word. That way, if you add pictures, you can actually start adding alt text to those pictures within Word. And then when you copy and paste the entire email, all the accessibility elements copy and paste with that email. So all of the alt text, the metadata that you add to a hyperlink or to a picture, when you copy and paste, all that carries over into your email field. So I would start by writing your email in Word and then copying and pasting it. Prioritize text. So I have gotten a lot of emails specifically with the COVID-19 pandemic with infographics and bar charts and institutional logos, and almost nothing I've gotten from some of my institutions have any description of those pictures whatsoever. So I would then prioritize text because screen reading technologies are the most popular assistive technologies that students use by far, and they're compatible across many different devices. So if you can emphasize text and make your message as simple and short as possible, but prioritizing that text, because every image you add, you make sure that, you have to make sure to add your alt text to make sure a student knows what that picture is saying. So keeping it as simple as possible and prioritizing text. Again, using a very simple readable font, I would default your emails to Times New Roman or Cambria is also good, or Verdana, so that every single email you send out, it's always going to be in an ADA compliant font, nicely contrastive with nice serifs. Again, I have started changing some of my background to the dark background. Some of the accessibility features in new iPhones and new Androids and on new computers allow you to change and shift the background for time of day, but always make sure that that font really pops from that background. And the most contrastive type of screen is a light background with black font on it, or I use dark blue font on that dark background. That's the most ADA compliant and the most contrastive. Adding informational alt text to pictures. So here is an example of what I mean when you're going to build your emails and start adding pictures and multimedia. I would caption this picture as a picture of two college students walking on campus. They are wearing backpacks and talking to each other. So if I hovered my mouse over there and interacted with that element, and I was using a screen reader technology or a different assistive technology, I should have a description of what's actually happening in that picture. The only exception is that on websites and in emails, if the image is decorative, so if you have like an institutional logo, you don't need to caption that. You don't need to add alt text to that in ADA. However, anything educational or instructional in nature, if you're trying to teach a student something, if you're trying to inform them of something, if it's an infographic or a chart, anything that is teaching something has to have alt text in it to describe to a student specifically what that is, and that includes pictures. So that is how I would caption that picture. And in this PowerPoint, and I'll show you an accessibility feature in a second, you can do it very easily. And then adding informative alt text to hyperlinks. So again, just like pictures, I have gotten lots of emails with lots of hyperlinks. I actually got an email blast for a COVID-19 resource page that had about 35 hyperlinks in it. And none of them had alt text in them. So if I were to embed this hyperlink in an email, I would then add the alt text to say, if you click this link, you will be directed to. That'll make it really easy. If a student is using our screen reader technology, they can hover their mouse, get that informative alt text to know where that hyperlink goes, and then click and then be on their way. So that is kind of a beginning to end writing an ADA compliant email, starting in Word, prioritize text, start with font and color contrast, add alt text to your pictures and your hyperlinks. You should be in really good shape. And then writing other forms of ADA compliant materials, use the accessibility features built into Word and Adobe and PowerPoint. And I've added links that you can use to go to actually the Microsoft documentation pages to use the accessibility features. A lot of them, if you're running on like Word 2010, a lot of those features weren't built in until the most recent update. So one, update your Word, update Adobe if you have those licenses available to you, but a lot of those accessibility features are kind of brand spanking new and they are awesome. And the documentation on the Microsoft and Adobe websites are also awesome. Again, kind of boilerplate, use a simple common readable font, very strong color contrast, and preferably a light background and a dark font is best. Adding alt text to pictures and hyperlinks. Also, a lot of learning materials are shared. So I, again, am on a lot of listservs, a lot of PDFs get flying around. And a basic concept you have to kind of ask yourself, or a basic question is, where has this PDF been? Where has this file been? How many times has this file been emailed to someone, who emailed to someone else, and who created the file in the first place, and is it ADA compliant? In some of our institutional communication that we've made through Trellis Company, we've recommended that if you're going to send COVID-19 related information, the CDC and the World Health Organization are great resources because all their stuff is ADA compliant. It's excellent. You know who created that document, so when you send it to students, you know what information that they have is going to be ADA compliant. A lot of public-facing information that's shared on listservs, that person did not think about accessibility when they were creating those materials, and that might be a serious hurdle for your students. And if it comes from your email, you are on the hook for it in terms of ADA and not the person who created it. So think about, do faculty member think about syllabi? You can actually add an audio file to a PDF that will read the entire syllabus to a student through the Adobe accessibility features. That's fantastic new technology. Class handouts, campus flyers, anything on your social media. So if you're linking a social media profile to your .edu website, all of your social media posts have to be ADA compliant as well, because you're educating a student on a certain process. So if you're encouraging a student to complete the FAFSA and you have a FAFSA flyer, and you're going to blast that out to Twitter, to Facebook, and to Instagram, that picture has to be ADA compliant because it's linked back to your .edu and it's serving an educational purpose. You got to be really careful about how you're disseminating information and whether or not the person who built it knew to build it with ADA compliance in mind. And then a lot of other resources are linked to other websites. So if you hyperlink a resource on your .edu that links to someplace else for an educational purpose, you may be on the hook for that other resource's non-ADA compliance. So be thinking about how much information do you have to link away to elsewhere, and on those other websites, is that material ADA compliant? And that's just an institutional decision that you have to make in your communication staff. How much do you want to link away? And then how much do you want to build on the website ADA compliant so you know that students are accessing your site and that you are compliant. So at this point, I'm going to share a few resources. I'm going to do a few tech demos, and then I will take questions at the very end, and just about 15 minutes, so we're doing just fine with time. The Department of Ed, obviously, it's coming from them. They have a whole mess of 504 compliance information. If you haven't picked through some of the information, please do. It's really informative. It's really pretty simple to read as well. I've also hyperlinked the WCAG Quick Reference Guide. It is not a beach read. It is not a simple read, but they do their best to explain what an error is if you're missing information, and then giving an example of what that might look like. They're doing their best for it to be a practitioner-friendly guide, even though we are kind of talking about web development in some ways and computer science in some ways. Microsoft Windows has great accessibility resources, and there's actually software that is built in to every Windows and every Mac machine that helps you understand the accessibility and the web accessibility of your own devices, which I'll show you kind of in a second. Mac users need to hold Command and F5, and that launches VoiceOver. And I've actually written a few papers and done a few ADA compliance audits for institutions that only uses VoiceOver. It's a screen reader technology. It's very robust. It's built into every single Mac machine for free. It'll be updated forever for free. So if you're on a Mac machine right now and you're curious, hold Command, hit F5, it'll launch VoiceOver, and then you can actually control with your keyboard or with your mouse all the screen reading technology that's available. Try it yourself. Go onto your own website, your own institutional website, and see how much you can explore. When I started exploring web accessibility when I was a high school teacher, I did the exact same thing, but I was using Narrator on Windows because we were kind of a Windows school. And so you hold the Windows button, Control, and Enter, and that launches Narrator. And Narrator lets you do the exact same thing in many ways that VoiceOver does. It's a screen reading technology. You can bring up windows, you can navigate websites, you can control the entire program with your keyboard or your mouse, or just your keyboard, or just your mouse, and you can integrate other assistive technologies into VoiceOver and Narrator that helps control the screen and read the screen. A lot of folks don't know that these are built in for free into pretty much every device that's ever been created, but it's in Mac machines and Windows machines. The couple of audit resources that I use, I love TNON's website. TNON is an online accessibility checker. It is a paid feature, but it's very affordable in my opinion. It allows you to take a hyperlink or any, your homepage URL, copy and paste it into their software, and run a compliance check. It'll tell you how many level A, AA, and AAA errors you have. And the great thing about TNON and about A-Checker as well is you can export those errors to an Excel spreadsheet or to an Adobe PDF. And then you can pass that on to your web developer and say, hey, I just ran an accessibility audit. It's telling me that we have these errors on our website. How can I work with you to make this right? Having that report, I've ran hundreds of reports for folks in the past, and they love the Excel document because it gives them a really quick reference of everything that's wrong, specifically where in the code they're missing information, more for the web development side, and then what level of compliance it is, so you can kind of prioritize level A and level AA compliance, because that is the threshold set forth by law. Defining your website language. Even Grounds is a really great accessibility kind of initiative organization. They're fantastic. They have a great newsletter as well. Defining the website language is very, very simple. It's as simple as one email or one line of code in your website. And then all of a sudden your website will have its language defined, and students will know when they land, they're either going to have English content, Spanish content, whatever your context is. Adobe also has great accessibility features. I know lots of offices just run everything through Adobe to see if it's ADA compliant or not, especially for PDFs. Before I publish a PDF or kind of share anything, I always run it through Adobe. There's an accessibility check feature in Adobe that's really robust, and Adobe also updates constantly. They're kind of like Microsoft and Apple, that all of their assistive technologies, like once you have them, you're not going to pay a whole lot for like a software upgrade or download new software. It all just updates in the background. It's fantastic. Webaim has a really great font guide. I'm a huge font nerd. I love fonts. I studied fonts as part of like kind of my special education graduate curriculum and accessibility curriculum. Webaim has a fantastic guide about how you choose fonts, when they're more appropriate than others, and giving you an idea of how you can build your website, especially as it has to jibe with the marketing and communication information. I know a lot of schools have an official font that they use for everything. Sadly, that font may not be that ADA accessible and that ADA compliant, but Webaim can take you a long way there. And then Penn State is kind of a leader in the web accessibility space at the post-secondary level, and they have a really great color contrast guide that can show you how to measure the contrast of your screen, text on dark backgrounds to make sure that your entire website, or to the best of your ability, is ADA compliant. So that kind of finishes a lot of the resources. The only other technology I want to share with you quickly is I'm going to exit out of my PowerPoint and stop my share, but then I'm going to reshare with you a Microsoft Word document. And within Microsoft Word now, you have the ability to do voice dictation. And this actually was very recently built in, and I'm going to share this in just a second. Pull up this Word document. There it is. Okay, so everyone should see my Word document now. So just as the subtitle feature was built into PowerPoint, Word just built in the dictation feature, and it's actually pretty accurate. And it's also built into Outlook. So there have been some times where I've had a lot to say to somebody. I'll click on dictate, I'll just talk it through and then go back and edit. And if you watch me just for a second, you turn on the dictation feature and start talking. And then when you're ready to end your sentence, you just say period. And there you have it. So really, really accurate. I've used it a lot, so it's trained to my voice and might be a little bit more accurate for me than it will be for you. But the more you use it, the better it gets. It recognizes, you can say comma, semicolon, dash, and it recognizes punctuation, and it's really pretty accurate. So this is one accessibility feature that might be more of a kind of functionality efficiency feature that you can use that was an accessibility feature for content creation and that kind of stuff. So I will reshare my screen. I will zip through the accessibility resources and the questions slide. And then now I guess I'll feel free to take questions. You can either chat them to me or bring them up in the Q&A. I know somebody asked a question about, will the recording and slide deck be available? And absolutely it will. And also on the very first slide or second slide, I think you have my email. So if you have any follow-up questions that I can't address right now, I'd be happy to take your questions later. So I will give folks a few minutes to type in any questions in the chat if you have any questions.
Actually, a few questions while you were presenting. If
Great.
I will field them to you now. So we had a question from Christine. Christine, thanks for submitting your question. When I'm running webinars with other speakers, I have tried to use my PowerPoint with subtitles in the hope that it would pick up their speech in addition to mine, but it doesn't seem to pick up speech that comes out of the computer speaker. Do you have any suggestions?
So the way that the mic is positioned on most laptops, most times the mics are trying to point at an angle toward you. So it may be the angle at which your speakers are aiming and your microphone is aiming on your laptop. And there's also, it's a pretty smart technology, but I know Mac has it built into their microphone and their speaker technology that it tries to only pick up spoken voices and not what's actually being played on the screen. I don't know how many of y'all notice, but when you're on a Zoom call, a lot of times it'll only pick up my voice and not the other person's background noise that I'm hearing through my computer speakers. That is that really cool AI technology that's built into a lot of speakers and microphones. And also there is a situation where depending on how new the computer is and how good the microphone is, there's a certain kind of distance to speaker ratio that everyone needs to be within 3 feet of the speaker or the microphone to pick up everyone's voice, but it won't pick up the computer screen, while some other laptops or like mobile devices are really good at picking up computer screens as well. If you're trying to also use the voice captioning for someone who's on a Zoom meeting with you, that you're running the software, but they're talking to you, there's gonna be a lag, because the way that PowerPoint uses the voice dictation feature and the closed captioning feature is that it actually integrates with an online database. So PowerPoint is connected to the internet and uses internet databases to make sure your speech is as accurate as possible. And I've noticed when I disconnect the internet and then reconnect PowerPoint, the accuracy of the subtitling feature goes way down. So part of it might also too be just internet lag, because the voice command technology and the kind of voice to text does rely on the internet. So hopefully that helps answer, but it's really tough to have a built-in microphone pick up and dictate what's coming through on a computer screen. That's really tough.
Thanks, Zach. That was the only question that we received during your presentation. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to submit them through the chat or through the Q&A feature, and we will answer them as they come in.
Absolutely, and I guess too, one more thank you to everyone who showed up, just to share a few quick stories of folks that work in institutions and are well aware of web accessibility. It's really, really hard to get traction on having an ADA discussion at an institution, because it is really, really hard. It is really tough to be 100% web compliant and then have the institutional presence that everyone on campus is auditing their technology and auditing their communication before they send an email, before they make a PowerPoint, before they make a PDF file. So thank you so much everyone for coming and getting the discussion started, because especially right now during a crisis situation, it may be everyone's instinct to communicate as quickly as possible and not have this kind of thought to how are we communicating our pictures and infographics and PDFs and other multimedia built in a really robust way that all students have access to the same information that all other students do. I think sometimes we're in a rush to communicate and we aren't a little more purposeful about how we're communicating. So thank you for coming and kind of continuing this message. And at any time you have a question about a software that you're using or an accessibility software, I know that in-house Trellis uses Adobe to do a lot of accessibility auditing and just checking ADA compliance. I know a lot of other offices do as well. If you have any questions about any of those software, or if you found something really new that your campus uses that you really like, please send me an email, because I'm always trying to improve this presentation and add as much new content as possible, because as technology changes and as the internet advances, it'll become harder and harder to be ADA compliant. We definitely have to stay on top of it. So.
Great, thanks, Zach. So we haven't really received any other questions. So with that,
Okay.
I'll go ahead and wrap up our webinar here today. Again, the slide deck and recording will be made available on our website, and I will send this out as soon as we have it. And Zach has shared his contact information, so feel free to reach out to him if you need any additional support or would like to share any best practices. And I will also remind everyone that when you exit out of the webinar, you will be a Zoom will pop up a screen with an exit survey or feedback survey. We would really appreciate it if you would take it. It's just a couple of questions, should take you no more than 2 to 3 minutes. We'd like to get your feedback on this webinar and also your feedback on what kinds of webinars y'all would like to hear from us about. So with that, we'll sign off today. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We hope that you and your loved ones are staying safe and healthy during this time, and we hope to connect with you soon. Take care, everyone. Have a good afternoon.